The laughter started with the orchard. Not the plums. Not the harvest. The orchard itself. Because nobody planted wild plums on purpose. At least not 40 acres of them. Margaret Hale remembered the exact morning Dale Harper drove past the hillside and nearly put his truck into a ditch. He slammed the brakes. Backed up. Looked again. Then climbed out. No. Margaret kept planting saplings. Morning, Dale. He pointed toward the hillside. No. Margaret looked up. What? The trees. Silence. Long silence. The trees. Dale folded his arms. Tell me those aren't wild plums. Margaret smiled faintly. They're wild plums. Dale looked toward the sky, as if asking for help. Why? The Hale farm sat among the rolling hills of southern Missouri where apples, peaches, and commercial orchards dominated the landscape. People planted things markets understood. Things buyers requested. Things with established prices. Wild plums weren't one of them. Wild plums grew in fence rows, creek banks, pastures, road ditches, places nobody paid attention to. Nobody except Margaret. The idea began 8 years earlier. Her grandfather Samuel Hale used to walk the property every spring carrying an old coffee can. One afternoon Margaret followed him through a pasture covered in blooming white plum trees. The scent filled the air. Sweet. Sharp. Almost impossible to ignore. Samuel picked a plum from one of the trees, then handed it to her. Try it. Margaret bit into it. The flavor exploded immediately. Sweet. Tart. Complex. Nothing like grocery store fruit. She frowned. Why doesn't anybody grow these? Samuel laughed. Good question. Silence. Then, seriously, he looked toward the trees. Because nobody knows what to do with them. The answer bothered her. Because the fruit tasted incredible. Years later, after Samuel passed away, the memory stayed. So did the question. Margaret began researching, reading, calling agricultural extensions, visiting libraries. The deeper she looked, the stranger things became. Wild plums handled drought well, handled disease well, handled poor soil well. Yet almost nobody cultivated them commercially. Every explanation sounded roughly the same. No market. That answer irritated her. Because no market and no value weren't necessarily the same thing. Most people treated them as identical. Margaret didn't. 3 years later, she planted the first orchard. The county immediately decided she'd lost her mind. At the co-op, Dale created material instantly. Good news, everybody. Rick Harlow looked up. What? Margaret's planting weeds. Laughter spread across the room. Margaret kept drinking coffee, mostly ignoring it. Mostly, but privately. The jokes bothered her more than she admitted. Because orchards required patience. Money disappeared long before profits appeared. One evening, Emily Hale sat across from her at the kitchen table. Bills covered half the surface. Outside, rows of young plum trees stretched toward sunset. You okay? Margaret stared through the window. No. Emily nodded. The orchard. Silence. Then, maybe. Long pause. You still think it'll work? Margaret looked toward the trees. Thousands of them. Years away from maturity. Then she smiled slightly. I think the trees do. Emily laughed softly. That wasn't my question. No, it wasn't. The first meaningful harvest arrived 4 years later. Then another. Then another. By the 6th season, the orchard looked magnificent. White blossoms in spring. Deep purple fruit in summer. Healthy trees. Heavy production. Margaret finally felt hopeful. Then she hauled samples to the county co-op. And everything fell apart. Grant Mercer studied the fruit tray silently. Then frowned. Then called another employee over. Then another. Margaret hated that immediately. Nobody called extra people for good reasons. Grant picked up one plum. What exactly are these? Margaret stared. Wild plums. Silence. Long pause. Then, commercial wild plums? Margaret blinked. They were wild. Now they're in an orchard. Several employees laughed. Grant didn't. That worried her. What market are you selling into? Margaret folded her arms. Fruit. Grant sighed. The kind of sigh people use before disappointing conversations. Margaret. Silence. There really isn't a market for these. The room became quiet. She stared. What? Grant pointed toward the fruit. Fresh market buyers don't want them. Processors aren't asking for them. Distributors aren't requesting them. Long pause. Then, so who buys them? Grant shrugged. Depends. On what? Another shrug. Maybe preserves. Maybe feed. Silence. Margaret stared. Feed? Grant looked uncomfortable. Pig feed pays something. The room laughed. Not cruel laughter. Worse. Casual laughter. The kind people use when they think something is obvious. Margaret picked up the sample tray. You serious? Grant nodded. Mostly. The drive home felt twice as long. Pig feet. Pig feet. Pig feet. The words repeated inside her head. Years of work surrounded her. Years. And apparently the best advice available suggested feeding the harvest to livestock. That evening, she stood among the plum trees, watching wind move through branches heavy with fruit. Emily found her there after sunset. You okay? Margaret laughed once. Not because anything felt funny. Because otherwise she might have been angry. The co-op thinks I grew pig feet. Silence. Emily blinked. What? Pig feet. Long pause. Then, that might be the dumbest thing I've heard all year. Margaret looked toward the orchard, then shrugged. Maybe, but privately. Doubt arrived. Because buyers weren't exactly lining up. Small orders appeared, then disappeared. A few jam makers purchased modest quantities. Local customers bought some. Nothing substantial. Nothing enough. Months passed. Then another harvest arrived. And another. The fruit remained excellent. The market remained disappointing. One October morning, Margaret stood beside stacked harvest crates wondering whether the county had been right all along. Then she heard an engine. Not local. Definitely not local. A dusty black pickup rolled slowly down the orchard lane. Out of state plates. Mud from a long drive. The truck stopped beside the loading area. A man climbed out. Tall. Silver-haired. Travel-worn. He looked exhausted. Like he'd spent all day behind a steering wheel. Then he looked toward the plum crates. And smiled. A real smile. The kind people make when they've finally found something. He walked toward Margaret. Extended his hand. My name's Henry Lawson. Margaret shook it. Nice to meet you. Henry looked toward the orchard again. Then back. I drove 10 hours to find these. Silence. Margaret frowned. Find what? Henry smiled wider. The wild plums. Margaret stared at the man for several seconds. Because nobody drove 10 hours for wild plums. At least nobody she knew. 10 hours. The man nodded. Yes. Long pause. Why? The stranger looked toward the stacked harvest crates. Then toward the orchard stretching across the hillside. Finally he smiled. Because nobody grows these anymore. Silence. Margaret frowned. You know what they are? The man laughed softly. Very much. He picked up a plum from a nearby crate, turned it in his hand, studied the deep purple skin, then bit into it. His eyes widened immediately. Exactly. Margaret blinked. Exactly what? The man extended his hand again. Henry Lawson. Lawson Creek Meadery. That meant absolutely nothing to her. Henry noticed. You don't drink much mead, do you? Margaret shrugged. Not really. Henry nodded. Most people don't. Then he held up the plum. But people remember flavor. The next 3 hours felt strange. Very strange. Because Henry examined the fruit more carefully than anyone ever had. He tasted samples from different sections of the orchard. Asked questions about soil, rainfall, harvest timing, tree age, everything. At one point he stood beneath a tree with his eyes closed, simply smelling the fruit. Emily looked at Margaret. Margaret looked back. Neither knew what to make of it. Finally Margaret asked, So what exactly does a meadery do? Henry smiled. Mead is fermented honey. Silence. Then, like wine. Similar. He pointed toward the plum. But fruit changes everything. Long pause. People have used wild plums in mead for generations. Margaret folded her arms. Then why has nobody called me? Henry laughed. Because everybody wants predictable ingredients. He looked around the orchard. These aren't predictable. That answer bothered her. Is that bad? Henry smiled wider. No. He picked up another plum. It's valuable. That evening Henry stayed for dinner. Afterward they sat on the porch overlooking the orchard. The setting sun painted the trees gold and purple. Henry leaned back. Do you know what your problem is? Margaret laughed softly. Apparently everyone does. Henry pointed toward the orchard. You've been talking to commodity buyers. Silence. Then. So. He smiled. Commodity buyers want uniformity. Same size. Same shape. Same color. Same flavor. He picked up a wild plum from the table. These aren't uniform. Margaret nodded. No. That's why they're special. The answer stayed with her. Because nobody at the co-op had ever called the fruit special. Different. Yes. Difficult. Yes. Worthless. Apparently. But never special. The next morning Henry loaded several coolers with fruit samples. Then handed Margaret a business card. Give me 3 weeks. She frowned. For what? Henry smiled. To prove something. Then he drove away. The county laughed harder after hearing about it. Naturally. At the co-op, Dale nearly dropped his coffee. A mead maker? Margaret nodded. Yes. Silence. Then. No. Yes. No. Yes. Rick looked over. You expect us to believe somebody drove 10 hours for wild plums? Margaret shrugged. Doesn't matter. What? He already drove. That answer irritated Dale immediately. 3 weeks passed. Then 4. Then 5. Nothing. No calls. No contracts. No offers. By the 6th week, Margaret started feeling foolish again. Maybe Henry simply liked free fruit. Maybe the county had been right all along. One evening, she stood beneath the orchard watching leaves drift through cool autumn air. Emily walked over. You thinking? Margaret nodded. Yes. Bad thinking. Long pause. Maybe. Then headlights appeared at the end of the lane. A familiar black pickup rolled slowly toward the farm. Emily sat up immediately. Margaret stood. The truck stopped. Henry climbed out carrying a thick folder. And unlike last time, he wasn't smiling. That worried Margaret immediately, because people usually smile when bringing good news. Henry walked toward her, then suddenly burst out laughing. A huge laugh. The kind people make when they're genuinely excited. You have any idea what you've grown? Margaret blinked. Wild plums. Henry shook his head. No. He spread papers across the truck hood. Laboratory analyses. Fermentation reports. Flavor studies. Production projections. Pages and pages of information. Henry pointed to one report. These plums produce extraordinary fermentation characteristics. Another page. Incredible aroma retention. Another. Outstanding complexity. Margaret stared, because none of those words meant much to her. Henry noticed, then simplified. Your plums make exceptional mead. Silence. Then. Oh. Henry laughed again. That all you've got? Margaret shrugged. I don't know anything about mead. Fair. Then he handed her a contract. She looked down. Read the numbers. Stopped. Read them again. Then once more. Because surely she'd misunderstood. Surely. $12. Henry nodded. Yes. Silence. $12 per pound. Yes. Long pause. Then. All of it. Henry smiled. If you'll sell it. Emily nearly dropped the paperwork. Margaret simply stood there. Because the offer wasn't good. It wasn't excellent. It was unbelievable. Pig feed prices disappeared instantly. Completely. Gone. The first shipment left the farm 2 weeks later. Then another. Then another. Black refrigerated trailers rolled into the orchard and loaded every harvest crate she could fill. People noticed immediately. Of course they did. Because unfamiliar trucks arriving repeatedly at a farm everyone mocked tends to attract attention. Dale nearly chased one down. At the co-op, conversations changed quickly. Who's buying her fruit? Heard it's some mead company. Paying premium prices. No way. Yes way. Grant Mercer hated every minute of it. Especially when Henry walked into the co-op one afternoon. The room went silent immediately. Grant looked up. Yes. Henry smiled politely. You're the man who called those plums pig feed? Silence. Nobody moved. Grant shifted uncomfortably. Well, Henry nodded. I wanted to thank you. Grant blinked. Thank me. Henry smiled wider. Yes. Long pause. Why? Henry looked around the room, then pointed toward the hills beyond town. Because if everybody understood their value. He smiled. I never would have gotten them. Nobody laughed. Not one person. 5 years later, the orchard doubled. Then doubled again. Specialty buyers arrived from across the region. Artisan beverage makers. Preserve companies. Fruit processors. The same trees everyone once mocked became one of the most profitable crops in the county. One autumn evening, Dale stood beside Margaret overlooking thousands of wild plum trees glowing beneath sunset light. You know what still bothers me? Margaret smiled slightly. What? Dale stared across the orchard. I laughed at this. Yes. No, seriously. He shook his head. For years. Wind moved softly through the trees. Long shadows stretched across the hillside. For years the co-op looked at Margaret Hale's wild plums and saw a problem. Too unusual. Too different. Too hard to fit into standard markets. Then one mead maker drove 10 hours and saw something nobody else bothered to see.